Cuba today is experiencing a humanitarian crisis, not in an acute emergency sense, but in something arguably far more insidious. A slow motion, multidimensional collapse that is grinding down the population's basic quality of life with no end in sight. The island's energy crisis is a defining feature. Blackouts averaging 19, 20 plus hours a day, sometimes for multiple days, in various provinces are now a common occurrence in Cuba. There's been seven nationwide grid collapses just between 2024 and 2025 alone, plus other several this year. Those grid collapses during 2024 and 2025 all caused not by a lack of oil, but but due to breakdowns in the aging power plant and distribution grid of the island. By mid-2025, Cuba's national power utility was meeting only about half of peak electricity demand. The easy explanation for this crisis, and one that the Cuban government prefers, is that it's all Washington's fault. The U.S. embargo and more recently Trump administration's effective oil blockade following the ouster of Nicolas Maduro in January are the cause of this electricity crisis. Now, we have to be clear. U.S. sanctions are real and they're incredibly damaging. Their effects are felt in Cuba on the ground. But today's conversation is mostly about what that narrative leaves out. It's the full picture and what is obscured out of that, often in that narrative. The Cuba Study Group has just published a major new report called Without Power, There Is No Country, Cuba's Electricity Generation Crisis, authored by our friend economist Ricardo Torres of American University. The report makes a carefully documented case that this crisis in Cuba of electricity generation has been decades in the making, the product of deliberate policy choices, misallocated investment, failed projects, and the fundamental constraints of a centrally planned economic model that has consistently prioritized other things other than the modernization of its own power grid. To discuss the report and help us understand the full dimensions of this crisis, I'm joined by Ricardo Torres and another foremost expert in Cuba's energy sector, Jorge Piñon, who's a senior research fellow at the University of Texas at Austin's Energy Institute, and one of the most authoritative voices on Cuba energy in the world. As I mentioned, this is an on-the-record conversation. We have 60 minutes together, so let's get right into it. Ricardo, just to help the folks that are joining us today, we want to help give them a clear baseline understanding of the Cuban system. If you can explain very briefly to someone who does not understand how Cuba's electricity system is structured, how would you go about explaining that to them?
Yeah. Well, first of all, Rick, and the Cuba Study Group and Katia, thanks for organizing this. So this report has been long in the making, and so we are happy, and myself especially, happy that it's out already. And it definitely comes at a very unique time in Cuba. The energy crisis, as you said, has been there for years, but the situation definitely got or has gotten a lot worse in the last year or so. So, for those who are not familiar with the system, I'd explain it this way. So, Cuba has one national power system, the SEN, Sistema Eléctrico Nacional, and the state utility UNE, Unión Eléctrica, is a key operator. So most electricity still comes from all fossil fuel plants, not from renewables. I'm using 2024 numbers because the last year's numbers are not ready yet. So keep that in mind. So in 2024, the system had about 5.3 gigawatts of installed capacity. The biggest block is the large thermoelectric plants. Then there is a layer of smaller distributed diesel and fuel oil generators. Then we have gas-fired generation, especially the one that comes from Energas. in the Varadero area. And then solar, wind, and hydro are still a very small part of that mix. So this is not a grid where renewables are carrying the country. It is still and above all an oil-based system. According to the most recent numbers, UNE operates 16 units in seven thermal or thermoelectric plants. And there's been, and it's important that we mention this, because there's been two important changes in the last year that we have to keep in mind to understand the entire operation of the system. So one is, since 2019, Cuba started importing electricity. So basically, it lists some floating power plants from Turkish firms, and they've been important in, as part of the system. They run on fossil fuels as well, fuel oil, and in 2024 they produced or generated around 20% of the country's electricity. That number must have gone down last year. So the second change is that I said that renewables are still a very small fraction of the total generation, but in 2025, Cuba added significant capacity in solar PV. And so the last numbers that we heard from officials in Cuba, they say that on a typical day in the last days of 2025, solar was contributing above 10% of the total electricity generated. In 2026, that changed a little bit because generation has come down and solar's share has increased as well. So that gives you a general idea of the system. It's based on fossil fuels, and it's also based on very old thermoelectric plants. All of them except one are above 30 years of operation.
Thank you. And Jorge, could you help us understand from a technical standpoint how common or unusual it is for a country of Cuba's size to have uh, an electricity grid and infrastructure like this today?
Is very rare. Particularly, we have to remember that Cuba's baseline thermoelectric power plants run on Cuban crude oil, on domestic production, about 40,000 barrels a day. Very few countries in the world run their electric power sector using crude oil. This crude oil, as we know, is heavy, high sulfur, high metals, extremely corrosive. So it's a vicious circle. They fix a unit, and within 6 to 8 weeks, it breaks down again because of the type of fuel that they run. That you don't see in many countries. There are some countries, by the way, in the Persian Gulf that do use crude oil as a feed for electric power generation. But in the rest of the world, this is very, very rare. On the solar power that Ricardo was talking about, we have to remember that solar today only contributes during when the sun is shining, during peak hours during the day. Cuba doesn't have utility scale storage capacity. So when the sun goes down, that's it. That's the bottom line contribution of solar. As Ricardo mentioned, distributed generation, the famous grupos electrógenos created by Fidel Castro during La Revolución Energética, yes, those run on fuel oil and also diesel. Those are also are having maintenance problems, but there they do have a deficit of fuel because of the lack of diesel. There is no deficit of fuel on the thermoelectric power plants since it's domestic crude oil production.
Thank you, Jorge. So, Ricardo, the report, which I want to emphasize again, was for the most part prepared prior to January 3rd, the day of the ouster of Nicolas Maduro. It's a report that we have been working on for a while because we felt it was important to document the deterioration of this energy infrastructure in Cuba and its root causes. So it focuses primarily through the end of 2025, though there were some updates that we made to respond to more recent occurrences, given the taking of Maduro and also some recent Trump measures by the Trump administration. But Ricardo, in this report, it documents a 25% drop in total generation between 2019 and 2025, with an average daily outage deficit exceeding over 1,500 megawatts last year. Can you walk us through the timeline? When did this all start going wrong, and what were the key inflection points that led us to where we are today?
Right. So let me say a few things to set the ground here. So first of all, Cuba is a country, an island in the Caribbean. It's always been dependent on imported oil fuels for all of its needs. Currently, our estimation is that Cuba imports or needs to import around 60% of its needs. So that's a structural characteristic of Cuba, and it's been there essentially forever. And most of that fuel has to come from import because the country cannot produce most of it. So one important phase here to understand the current situation is the so-called energy revolution in 2004 and 2006. That started after a major breakdown of the Antonio Guterres plant, and that policy expanded distributed generation, but it did not truly diversify the energy mix. I think that was its main problem. So instead, it left Cuba heavily dependent on costly oil-based generation, and actually it added increased the share of a costly fuel, which is diesel. So it's important to say that the current crisis did not come out of nowhere. And at some point, even during the energy revolution, the Cuban government said that they will place more important on those distributed generation units than on the thermoelectric plants. Then from 2010 to 2019, basically during those years, generation grew. Part of that was that Cuba enjoyed for most of those years a stable supply, mostly from Venezuela. And but during those that decade, essentially, that window of opportunity was not used to modernize the grid, to expand renewables at a scale, or to reduce dependence on imported fuel. It's important to say that as early as 2014, Cuba passed a policy at a government level saying that it wanted to increase the share of renewables on the electric mix. So those years basically were not used as a way to prepare the country and put it in more favorable conditions. Then the real, I think, downturn began in 2020. And I think it's been like a combination of factors. On the one hand, the lack of maintenance and sustained investments, have put the infrastructure in a very weak position. At the same time, um, Venezuelan oil, got tighter. Shipments to Cuba started to drop as early as 2016, but that became more acute after 2020. So less fuel, meaning less input, especially for those distributed generation sets. And the country tried to cover for the gap using importing electricity from the Turkish floating plants. But the problem there was financial. It was a costly solution, and that became eventually unsustainable. So year after year, the situation got worse. No long-term solution for that. And then in 2024 and 2025, well, we see how the situation got to levels that have impacted severely on the economy and on people's lives. And so at this point, the situation is so bad that The combination of infrastructure problems and fuel shortages mean that Cuba basically in the last few months of 2025 met only around 50% of the demand during the peak hours. A situation that is highly unusual, of course, means that the system is not able to generate all the electricity that the economy and society at large are demanding.
Thank you, Ricardo. Anything you would add, Jorge?
Yeah, if you want to follow Ricardo's timeline, all that you have to do is go ahead and take a look at a chart showing Venezuela's crude oil production for the last 10, 15 years. And that decline, you see it clearly, represented by what just Ricardo mentioned. From 2007 to 2016, Cuba was receiving from Venezuela around 92,000 barrels a day of oil. Cienfuegos was running at full speed. La Habana refinery was running at full speed. So again, they depended and they felt comfortable with subsidized oil, just like they did during this former Soviet Union. And this time, when you have subsidized oil, that it really doesn't cost you anything for all practical purposes, it's a barter agreement. Sure, you're sending doctors and specialists to Venezuela, but at the end of the day, you're not paying for that oil out of your pocket. That brought about a false sense of security. Also, all of the investments that the government put together on the tourist trade, growing the tourist business, really should have gone in rebuilding the infrastructure of the electric power sector. Yes, like you said, Ricardo, certainly the Helms-Burton and the Cuba Liberty Act impacts financial transactions, but I'm always surprised that did not impact the building of hotels in Cuba. So I believe that yes, they could have spent some of that money in rebuilding or recapitalizing the system, and situations will be much, much better today. But again, decaying infrastructure, all systems, lack of oil, run oil to be burning in the thermoelectric power plants, that brings us to where we are today.
Now, we know about the Venezuelan oil. You guys have been talking about it, but was there no contingency plan at other point or reliance on other suppliers? I mean, we've often heard of the Mexican government sending oil to Cuba, the Russians, other allies of the Cuban government sending oil. How reliable have those shipments been?
No, outside, we were always very, for example, if you take out Angola, what Cuba has done for Angola is unsurmountable. I mean, it is huge. Angola is today what it is because of Cuba. Angola is one of the largest producer of oil, a major exporter of oil. We have never seen Angola sending any oil to Cuba. Algeria, seldom you would see a cargo, but you do some cargo. Brazil, today the largest producer of oil in Latin America is Brazil. And you don't see Cuba's friend Lula sending oil to Cuba. The only one that really began that trend from others besides Venezuela was Andrés López Obrador in Mexico when he started sending to Cuba what it turned out to be between 20 and 22,000 barrels a day. So you had Venezuela, you had Mexico, and then at least once a quarter you will have a Russian cargo. But out of those three, there was nobody else that would be willing to give Cuba, I underscore again, free oil. Cuba has never paid, that I'm aware, with hard cash, hard currency, any of the oil that they have received from any of these countries.
Yeah, if I may, Rick, just to mention one thing, it's important to say because especially in the current situation, we've heard so many times, especially from Cuba, directly that people are surprised that Cuba is not getting more support from other countries. And what Jorge says is it's has another dimension, which is for all of those countries, Angola, Algeria, Brazil, even for Mexico, even Russia. Oil is part of their economies, and oil is a major generator of foreign exchange. Perhaps the only exception is Brazil. So those are commercial operations. One thing is that if you run into emergencies, you get support, a one-off support from a friend, an ally. And a different thing is to essentially structure your economy, your economic model based on the assumption that somehow you are going to receive oil, a commodity as valuable as oil, on preferential conditions forever. That's not sustainable. I think it's something that we have to keep in mind. This is not to say that perhaps, I mean, even without the oil embargo imposed by the executive order of the Trump administration, not to say that some of those countries may want to help Cuba, but the thing is, a one-off action is not the solution for Cuba's problem. So again, those companies they have to face their shareholders. They exist because they want to make a profit, and so it's a commercial operation. And so it's hard to see how Cuba could get the amount of fuel it needs from any of those countries or eventually others outside the general conditions of a normal, commercial operation. So the lesson here is very clear. It's not sustainable to think that you can postpone domestic reforms on the assumption that somehow you are going to find an ally that is going to provide something as valuable as oil on preferential conditions forever. That's not sustainable. And I think that's what we also have to take a look here to understand the general situation.
But the issue is also here, and Ricardo has mentioned it before. For all practical purposes, Cuba is bankrupt. So how are they going to pay for this oil? They don't have the cash, and they just don't have the money. So that is the other problem. It's not only the economic model, but it's also why did they give up on the six or seven floating power systems that they rented from Turkey? They had to supply fuel oil for the power ships, and they had to pay a very high rent. Eventually, they gave up. Why? Because they didn't have the money. Cuba cannot afford to pay, as Ricardo says, on the regular commercial terms and conditions for oil. Today, Brent, I think it was 103, 105 a barrel. Diesel, it's close to $5 a gallon. Cuba just don't have that money to pay for the true value of oil and fuels.
Ricardo, let's talk a little bit about the investment record that you cover in your paper. And again, for those that haven't received the paper, though everyone in this call probably had access to it through our newsletter or posts online, you can always find it at cubastudygroup.org. It's right there on our homepage. You have a very striking chart in that paper. I think it's figure 7, where you cover the trajectory of investment, total investments, but particularly investments in tourism and investments in utilities such as electricity, gas, and water. And we see that chart really go K-shaped around, I would say, around 2010, to the point that by 2020, you see that Cuba is directing nearly 48% of total national investment into tourism, while electricity, gas, and water is receiving only 9.4%. You also talk about Russian credits that were offered to build 800 megawatts of new thermal capacity that Cuba couldn't access because they couldn't come up with their own 10% contribution as part of that deal with Russia. Um, Tell us a little bit about this investment record, and what does it tell us about what the priorities that have been taken and why by the Cuban government?
Yeah. So on the report, I basically wanted to structure the argument there on two fronts. One was with the resources that Cuba already had, how were they distributed or assigned, allocated, and that informs about the priorities, which are, I mean, very, especially very telling in the context of Cuba, because Cuba is a highly centralized economy in that sense. So the government does, really has the capacity to allocate most resources on the economy. And the other argument, so it was more about how Cuba managed some specific projects that were supposed to be like sort of a launching pads for the expansion of renewables, for instance. Although you also mentioned the project from with Russian money basically to add new capacity in terms of thermoelectric plants. So the thing is that it's important to add, or I want to add, use the webinar in this case to add like another dimension, which I think I briefly touched upon in the report, but perhaps is good to expand here, which is a very basic notion about energy infrastructure in general and electric grid infrastructure in particular. That infrastructure, those systems are expensive. And if your economy is not expanding, it means that you are not having the resources, enough resources to invest in maintenance and eventually to expand capacity. So that's why there is a direct link between economic performance and then how sustainable and how healthy your energy infrastructure is going to be. And in the case of Cuba, economic performance has not been good for many years, decades, we may say. Then there is, of course, a big discussion for those who follow the Cuba affairs. Who is to blame for that performance? The embargo or the economic model? Well, I think the two factors are at play, but the thing is that what Cuba can control is its economic model. It has a direct control over its economic model. And even when Raúl Castro started talking about the process of actualización, it produced a diagnostics of the economy, and it very clearly accepted the fact that our economy was not doing well, and that we had to do something about it. And then, of course, the rest of history, and those changes were largely ineffective in lifting that performance over the years. But this is a very important notion to keep in mind when we assess the overall situation in Cuba. So, given the performance of the Cuba's economy, we would not expect the country to have a healthy energy infrastructure at this point. Then, on top of that, and especially after 2015, is when we saw a big change in the trend. Cuba increased the share of investments in over its GDP. I mean, try to set aside more resources for investment. And what happened was that most of those resources, close to 40% on average during 10 years, were allocated basically to hotel infrastructure on the island. I guess the assumption there was, and perhaps using as a baseline the last 2 years of Obama administration, so we need to, be ready for this touristic boom, and we want to capture a larger share of the revenues being generated by those visitors. But the reality is that scenario changed very quickly. I mean, already in 2018, we started seeing that numbers were coming down. There were measures taken by the Trump administration, but also that boom about Cuba. Everyone wanted to go to Cuba before they changed it too much, and that kind of things. That started changing. And those plans were not adapted to the new situation. And of course, for a country like Cuba, a small economy that was not growing very fast, given the limited resources, you've got to be more strategic when it comes to where to allocate those resources. And we didn't see that kind of strategic thinking there. Energy infrastructure, particular electricity generation, is key for any economy. I mean, you cannot imagine, you cannot even start thinking about development without electricity in the 21st century. So it should have been a priority. And only in 2024, late 2024, is when the government came up with a more medium to long term plan to change that reality. So, given those priorities, as you mentioned, Cuba couldn't even set aside $150 million to contribute the 10% of the Russian loan that was established as a criteria to access those resources. So that could have been 4 new units, 800 megawatts in additional capacity that could have been already in place to alleviate the situation. Um, so yeah, I'll leave it there. I think it's important to again have a more like a holistic approach to the problem. And going back to one of the arguments that I tried to make during the report, which is this is a structural problem. And so, as since it is structural, doesn't have an easy solution, and certainly is not a short term. There is no short term remedy for the current situation.
Remarkable. And, in that same chart, we also see that after 2016, already after Trump has taken office, his first administration, and it seems that the Obama opening was in danger of not continuing to go on its intended route. You see investment in tourism continue to shoot up. Jorge, what's your take on that? Why does that line continue to go up
Well,
through
I think,
the years of the pandemic?
yeah, no, the question that I have is who was running or who is running the country? Where is the leadership that's putting together that long-term strategy, that long-term horizon of where the country is going, what needs to be done to tackle the ills, particularly in the energy sector? We already knew that. Where was the leadership? Who is in charge in Cuba? There's no long-term plan. There is no roadmap, with exception of put more money in the tourist trade and in the hotels. I mean, if this was a U.S. company, all of these people would have been fired a long time ago. So regrettably, that's where we are today. We are today where we are, by the way. Yes, the embargo certainly had an impact, but we are here today because of their own doing. They're the architects, they are the contractors, they are the engineers of this catastrophe, not the US, not the embargo. They made wrong decisions and they were not looking at the future of Cuba. They were looking at the future of themselves and how could they benefit. And the only area that they could benefit with or from was tourist trade. So no, they're guilty. They're the culprit of where Cuba's electric power sector is today.
Now, we've talked a little bit about the economic model and the need to change this model. The exact words that Ricardo calls for or uses in his report is we need a credible overhaul of the economic model as a precondition for attracting capital. Help us unpack that. And I pose this question to both Ricardo and Jorge. Why can't Cuba solve this energy problem alone without transforming its economic model? And what changes do energy investors and developers who have looked at Cuba seriously need to see in order to ever consider investing in this infrastructure or providing financing to help modernize this infrastructure? And in your answers, consider both the challenges on the Cuban side, which we devoted most of this conversation to, but also challenges presented by U.S. sanctions.
Right. Well, I mean, To keep it short, um, so one may think about this link between the economic model and a potential solution for the current energy crisis on along two main channels. On the one hand, as I said, um, we believe that if Cuba wants to become more prosperous, if the country, if the economy, aspires to have a higher rate of economic growth in the future, it fundamentally needs to change its economic model. And as I explained before, higher economic growth, much better economic performance is a precondition because that will create a scenario in which Cuba will have the resources to pay for the infrastructure that it needs and to compensate the capital that it will eventually need to arrive to the country to get that infrastructure ready, up and running. That's important. So we know that centralized economic systems like Cuba's, those systems existed in other countries, including very close allies of Cuba, like China and Vietnam. They know well the shortcomings of those systems. And so, if Cuba again wants to change that economic reality, that economic picture as a foundation for having a much better energy infrastructure in general, so the economic model needs to change in terms of both increasing the share of the private sector, but also the way resources are allocated on the economy, transforming or putting the market at the center of that process. Then the other channel is that, as I said, the challenges is so significant right now in terms of the amount of resources that will be needed to restore reliability in the system, to expand capacity, to meet demand, to increase renewable shares on the energy mix. That none of that will or could happen without foreign capital, be it loans, either bilateral from multilateral in financial institutions, or just foreign investment. But in any case, the rules that govern those processes in Cuba, as part of that economic model, they need to change as well. Cuba lives in a capitalist world. And so it is my opinion that Cuba needs to align its rules to the rules that govern that capital in how that capital moves around in the rest of the world. If Cuba says that it wants to attract foreign capital and it's serious about it, so that alignment needs to happen, and needs to happen in a fundamental way. When we talk to investors and also potential investors, they not only complain about the fact that Cuba is more risky because of the U.S. sanctions, they also say that Cuba is more risky because of a weak property rights on the country, but also the policy reversals that are that happen so systematically in as part of policy making in Cuba. So with those conditions, it's not realistic to believe that Cuba will be able to attract the amount of capital that it needs to repair and fix their system. So it's a precondition, and also once you unleash those forces, the economy starts growing faster. Then that is also the result, because you will be able to invest in the infrastructure, and the infrastructure itself, the availability of energy, electricity, will propel the economy forward. But again, to set in motion that process, something more fundamental needs to change in Cuba. And let me just finish by saying that it's important to think of that process as something that is more coherent and strategic than just incremental adjustments to the current model. That's completely different. And that's what we've basically seen in the last 35 years. And so, in that sense, not a surprise that the outcome hasn't been what even the Cuban government said it wanted in the first place.
Jorge, anything you would add?
No, the issue in the economic reforms of Cuba is the same as in the power sector. The challenge is structural. You cannot continue to put band-aids over the electric power sector, or for that matter, you cannot continue to put band-aids over your economic model. Investors need an acceptable rate of return, and they need a timeline that will guarantee them political and economic continuity for a long time in order to recover that initial investment. Remember, oil and electric power are major investment in which the foreign company puts all of the money up front.
Right.
In the first year, year and a half is when you invest hundreds, if not billions of dollars. Now you have to have a 20, 25, 30-year timeline in order to recover that investment. So if you think that they're going to come to a country and put at risk 500 million, $600 million on a new thermoelectric power plants with no guarantee of where that economy is going to be 5, 10, 15 years from now, you guys, we're crazy. Nobody's going to do it. And Cuba has shown over the years that they don't have that continuity politically or economically. The banks, the multilateral banks, it's just like when you go and apply for a mortgage. You have to show that you meet the conditionality of the bank. The bank is going to call that you meet certain conditions and they'll loan you the money, but you have to guarantee those conditions. So no, by the way, I don't know, Ricardo Torres, I see this road ahead extremely difficult. This transition is going to be very, very difficult because Cuba is not going to have its house in order for the banks and the big international companies to come in and invest thousands of millions of dollars at risk without having some sort of a guarantee that Cuba can pay back.
So when we're talking about investment requirements to close the supply gap in Cuba and the generation gap in Cuba, um, looking ahead, um, the report outlines over $6.6 billion in investment requirements needed in order to bridge that gap, spanning new thermal capacity, solar, wind, and biomass, a whole energy mix. That's a pretty significant number for a country in Cuba's situation. I'll pose this question to both of you. If you had to identify two or three of the most achievable near-term moves, los mangos bajitos, things that could materially reduce blackouts within the first year and a half to 3 years, um, assuming we see an opening of the economy, where would you what would you focus on?
Yeah, well, I'll leave the answer to the short-term solution to Jorge because this is better endowed in that regard. So, just to briefly explain that number, just not to create confusion. So, for that number, basically, I assume there will be some investments in new capacity. There will be some investment in repairing some of the newest plants on the system. At the same time, I took Cuba's government plan for renewables as good. So I didn't change anything there. Just put numbers, like updated the numbers using the most recent data that was available, international data, and then made the calculations. Now, one thing that we have to keep in mind as well, when the Cuban government put in place that plan to increase the renewables share in the electric mix up to 37%, they were projecting demand in Cuba by 2030 to be at a level that is almost twice as demand in 2025. And so that's unrealistic because in infrastructure in general and also in energy infrastructure in particular in this case, so the norm is you want to be ahead of demand growth, but not too much ahead because then it will be a waste of resources. So that's what that number came from. Then Jorge at some point also made a calculation that yielded something like between $8 to $10 billion. And I also want to mention one thing about the number. That number does not include, and I included in the report just like that. It does not include other maintenance that will need to be carried out in the coming years. It doesn't include investments in transmission and distribution. This is a system. We put the focus on generation because obviously that was, the real bottleneck. But it's not the only problem in the system. And certainly it doesn't include investments in storage. As Cuba increases renewable energy penetration in the electric mix, it will need to increase storage capacity as well. So it's a baseline number only, just to have an idea about the magnitude of the challenge that a country like Cuba has at the moment.
Also, that original number looked at greenfield projects, not brownfield projects. We have had personal contacts with two companies that have visited a lot of the Cuban power plants. And they say, we're not touching them with a 10-foot pole because under EPA rules here in the US, they will be Superfund sites. The soil contamination, topsoil, subsoil, even to the water table, particularly of metals like vanadium, for example, was so high that this company said, we would not build that new power plant over this existing one. We will have to go somewhere else. So that's a big issue. But again, I'm in Houston today attending a World Oil Conference, and the few people that have been able to talk, or we talked in the hallway, everybody says, we're not going to Cuba. By the way, we are also not going to Venezuela until the rules of the games are well established, until we see political continuity. A lot of people are afraid that they'll invest today, and within a couple of 2 or 3 days, there will be a new government, and that government will change the rules of the game. That has happened before. Exxon said it, by the way. Exxon said, we have been nationalized twice in Venezuela. We're not going to be nationalized a third time. That is also the issue with Cuba. Political continuity, economic continuity. They have to abide by the rules of the game if they really want to attract the major investors. My particular area of interest is biomass. I think that if you look at Brazil today, sugarcane is ethanol, sugarcane is alcohol, sugarcane is biomass, sugarcane is sugar. Cuba has a huge potential in the sugarcane industry. Brazil, 6% of Brazil's electric power generation comes from biomass. So particular industry is going to take a while, but I think sugar is important. But overall, we have to attract foreign investments. We have to convince the multilateral banks that Cuba will pay for that investment. And that, my friends, will take years. That will not happen overnight.
Thank you, Jorge. We have about 12 minutes before the end of the hour, and but we also have a pretty engaged audience, I see, and plenty of questions. So we're willing to go a little bit past the hour to address some of them. But I'd like to start tackling some of the questions that have been sitting in the Q&A now for a while. We have one here from Jorge Perez Lopez, who's asking, what's the status of domestic oil exploration and drilling programs? And what are its prospects?
Nothing new since the 2012 deep water projects that companies like Repsol and others undertook. And those drilling in the deep waters Gulf of Mexico were what we call non-commercial. They were not dry holes. They were non-commercial. In other words, they did not find the reservoir that they were looking for. A lot of geologists still right here at the, at the University of Texas will tell you that Cuba deserves a second look. But no, right now it is 40,000 barrels a day of production between Varadero and Puerto Escondido, and that's about it. There's nothing else in the horizon.
Thank you.
Just to say that Cuba Scoopet, they've said that they were able to reverse the decline in oil production last year, 2025. Body Morris increased compared to the year before. They said that they plan to continue increase production, but that increase is going to be marginal, I guess. And by the way, they also said at some point that domestic oil production like came down in part because they didn't have the resources to invest in new exploration and well development. I mean, also going back to what we said about investment priorities in the country.
Thank you. I have a question here from Carlos Rodriguez, who asks that a lot has been discussed about generation, but do we know what the state is of the distribution grid and the estimated cost to update it? Ricardo, in your 6.6 billion, are you including their upgrades to the distribution grid, or is it just generation?
No, that was just generation. As I said, that number doesn't include any transmission or distribution or storage investment that will be needed in any case to restore reliability on the system and the capacity to again generate enough electricity. I haven't done a proper study about the costs of those investments. That could be, like a sort of a follow-up to this report. By the way, I'm not an engineer, so on the way I look at this system is more from the role they play within the economic systems. And again, just to mention, now that Carlos, posed that question, a World Bank study, they conducted a significant study that was back in 2008 when they published the final results in terms of what were the kind of shared characteristics of fast-growing economies. And there was one that specifically talks to how investment, what is the role of investment in an economy. They said that those countries on average invested at least 25% equivalent to their GDP on a yearly basis, sustained for decades. And of that 25, 7% has to go to infrastructure. If you want to, and then of course, infrastructure is also transport, other things. So energy is just part of that. But just to give an idea in terms of how that must be a priority. By the way, in Latin America, the discussion is that that's never the case in most countries. But that figure in Cuba, not the specific one for investment, because we don't have a good number there, but the overall, that number in Cuba has been between 10 and 14% for 35 years, meaning that we are investing half of what we must if we want to change the contours of the country. And that, again, that applies to infrastructure as well.
Thank you, Ricardo. I got another question here from Carlos Fernandez Avalle. How can Cuba pay with hard cash? How do you deal with transaction persecution and with access to US dollars? I think it's part of a big part of the challenge. You can't pay with just hard cash. You need financing, and lots of it. What say you, gentlemen?
Well, who's going to, the consumer at the end of the day, the consumer has to pay for the true cost of clean and reliable electricity. And we know that in Cuba, it will take years for the consumers to get at a level of standard of living that they could afford the true cost of clean and reliable electricity. So don't count on the consumer subsidizing or paying for that electricity. And the government is bankrupt. So you guys or somebody, Ricardo Torres, somebody has to come up with the answer of who is going to pay. It's not the issue of timeline anymore. It's not the issue of how quickly can Cuba recover its thermoelectric power plants. No. Who's going to pay for it? I think that's the main question that we have. And I think it's going to take years for Cuba to be in a position, or for the Cuban consumer to be in a position that he or she can afford the true value, the true cost of clean and reliable electricity.
Right. Let me just use the question to also say something about the report. The report is mostly a view from the supply side of the equation. I didn't say much about demand control, demand policies. But certainly that's part of the problem here. So supply will be there if there is demand, and I mean demand that can actually pay for that.
That
It is a big issue, and I think long term, that's why I mentioned reform, a fundamental reform in the economic system, because reforms, if done well, will lead to better economic performance. That will in turn lead to people having more income year after year. And at some point, perhaps that would not be the initial step, but at some point, there has to be a reform in the tariffs that are charged for electricity. And like Jorge said, just that they reflect the true cost of reliable and clean electricity. And that's not the situation, no, especially in the residential sector. That's not the situation today in Cuba. But we need to get there if we want the electricity to be there and that it would not become again an obstacle for either economic growth or people's living standards.
We have a couple questions here about privatization of state assets, particularly generation, distribution. Assuming political and economic reforms happen, how do you see privatization of any of these assets playing a role here? Whether, again, generation, distribution, is it a good idea early on, bad idea? What would you have to say about that?
most models, for example, here in Texas, if you want to look at a state, the government is not even close to managing the grid or managing power. It's the private sector. So in most countries, it is the private sector, the ones that makes the investment decisions with the support of the government, either to private public partnerships. But at the end of the day, is that combination, that partnership between the state and the private investor that's going to get this ball rolling. But again, I come back. The Cuban government is in no position, politically, economically, or financially, to really support any type of economic expansion or economic growth in Cuba today. There's a lot of changes ahead of us that we still, many of them, have not realized what they are.
Yeah, I mean, just to say, I mean, I think myself, especially, I would not like to get ahead of events here. One could imagine that if real economic reform takes place in Cuba at some point, especially under the right political and international circumstances, um, privatization is a process that will take place. Now, specifically in this area, there are many models around the world. In some, well, Texas, I guess it's true in almost every state in the United States. It is really the private sector, the driving force there, and the state is just a regulator. In other countries in Latin America, it's quite common. There are state-owned enterprises that are part of the system. They are not the entire system, but they are part of the system. But let me just conclude here, just perhaps to give a few more minutes to other questions, saying that one thing that we have to keep in mind is that the public companies, state-owned enterprises that we see in other countries, in typical market economies, they are not comparable to the state companies that we have in Cuba. Just because they have the same name, it doesn't mean that they are the same type of entity, the same type of organization. Those enterprises are governed under completely different rules. And that's what's most important. If the rules are the ones that are needed, then eventually those enterprises will deliver, will work. So I leave it there, but it's important to keep that in mind because that confusion is quite common. It's a different type of state-owned enterprise. Also, the ones that stay in Cuba, but it's a different type of organization that is completely different from the one that we have today on the island.
Let's talk a little bit about what's going on right now with the Trump policy. You know, we've heard much of this oil blockade. Um, Many think that it's keeping anything from coming in. Um, we also, but at the same time, we're hearing about tankers that may or may not be reaching shore. Jorge, I know you spend your mornings diligently tracking every tanker that comes within, a few miles of Cuban shores. Is anything making it into the island today, as far as
No,
oil is concerned?
no, no. The Seahorse was drifting in the mid-Atlantic for about a week, week and a half. That's the one that was reported that it sneaked in and unloaded in Cuba. That wasn't correct. The Seahorse eventually started moving and ended up in Puerto Cabello in Venezuela. She never unloaded. Her draft was the same one as she crossed Gibraltar, came out of the Med. So no, that we can have tracked and that we have been able to document no tanker besides the Ocean Mariner that came from Mexico on the 9th of January. That was the last tanker that came into Cuba. Now, as of last night, I haven't checked this morning, you have a Russian flag tanker, which, by the way, is sanctioned by the European Union and is also sanctioned by OFAC. That's about 5 days away from Cuba. And it was still moving at a speed of about 12 knots coming toward Cuba. There are two U.S. Coast Guard cutters, one between Bahia de Nipe and Puerto Padre, and the other one between La Habana and Matanzas, that I guess are waiting for this Russian flag tanker. It has about 740,000 barrels of crude oil, which is the wrong thing to send to Cuba because it's going to take now anywhere between 15 and 20 days to refine that and come with a bunch of products that Cuba doesn't need when what Cuba needs is actually diesel. If you really want to get things taken care of soon, send diesel to Cuba, don't send crude oil. So anyway, we have to keep an eye on this tanker, see if it gets in. Maybe there's an arrangement between the U.S. and Russia to allow this tanker to come in under humanitarian circumstances. We'll have to wait and see.
How about these new authorizations allowing the sale of diesel to private sector importers? Obviously, those of us that track the private sector in Cuba understand that it's a sector that does not currently have the capacity to in any way replace previous shipments of diesel, much less other oil-based products. But they are now trying. There's diesel coming in through U.S. exporters selling to private sector actors on the country. We saw a report yesterday from Reuters that I believe 33,000 barrels have made it in so far through private hands. Again, the it seems that the aim here is not so much trying to replace what was the supply before, but trying to mitigate the worst of the humanitarian crisis. Um, could you both speak to a little bit about the role of the private sector today, what it is based on what we know, and where it could be if they are allowed to scale up imports and distribution?
Well, Cuba's diesel demand, the most recent numbers that we got is between 20 and 22,000 barrels per day. So the 30,000 that Reuters is reference, that's basically a day. But again, this is going to be this fuel that's being shipped to Cuba is very focused on where it's going to go. It's going to go to supply trucks and transportation for these small businesses to get their products and their goods to the final destination within Cuba. It's going to help, for example, Caritas to take all of the contributions that they have received and distributed out of Santiago de Cuba into the countryside to basically this fuel that is being sent to Cuba most likely will go, in my opinion, all of it, to the transportation sector to supply the trucks that deliver goods and services to areas outside or within the metropolitan area. The problem, Ricardo, is that when these ISO tanks were loaded, which was sometime in December or January, diesel was at 250 a gallon. Diesel today is at 460 a gallon. So my question is, can they do it today? Can someone today load an ISO tank with 25,000 liters of diesel, pay $4.50 a gallon for that diesel? How are they going to recover that cost? Are they going to then raise the fees to the Cuban consumers for the beans and rice that are being sold or for the services that are being offered? Can the Cuban consumer afford that increase in price? The issue today with that business is the price of the fuel that's being delivered to Cuba. Can the Cuban consumer afford that cost?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree with Jorge. I mean, I was about to say that the issue with the price now, hopefully it's temporary, but we never know. But certainly it has become an issue, at least in the last few weeks. Even the initial prices were already a challenge for a consumer like Cuba's. I mean, for most consumers. I mean, certainly some people can afford it, but I wouldn't say a majority. My position is, well, fuel is fuel. If some fuel is making its way into Cuba, welcome. Certainly is much, more than welcome by people there. And I agree that most of it will go to distribution services by those private companies. Jorge already mentioned the issue with the scale. It's simply just not enough, not comparable to I mean, necessities, the needs of a country in a typical situation, and it just mitigates the worst of the worst. It's no more than that. We'll see. I mean, it will scale up, but I mean, in the short to medium term, I mean, it's not the definitive solution for the shortage in Cuba.
The other thing, Ricardo Herrero, is who's going to monitor. The rule says that you get a permit, but you cannot sell to government entity. Who is the policeman in Cuba that is going to make sure that some of this fuel doesn't go into a police car or a police vehicle or to a Cuban government official? Where is that monitoring? Where is that policing to be sure that that fuel stays within the regulations of the license?
Yeah, it seems there's got to be a trade-off. Either you have very stringent end user or end consumer verification requirements, or you allow this to flow in to mitigate the humanitarian crisis. Because if you do the former, it could just grind everything to a halt, and then you are precipitating a humanitarian collapse. And it does not seem that that is the intent of this administration. Someone else asked, why, if Cuba's energy grid is collapsing on its own, why is Trump trying to push it to further to complete collapse through this oil blockade? I would argue that the aim of the policy is to drive it to the brink without precipitating a complete collapse in order to force the Cubans to the table to see if they can negotiate a deal that leads to comprehensive economic reforms and political reforms. But with the economic issue being, as Secretary Rubio mentioned, paramount right now because the economy is in a state of collapse and it just doesn't work. Do any of you have thoughts on that?
Ricardo, you take it.
Um, Well, I mean, the thing is that whether we like it or not, the U.S. imposes those sanctions because it can. And I think it's also seizing a moment. Um, Cuba is in a very weak position, its economy, but also its leadership, if you will. And so it's trying to, use the moment, seize that opportunity to advance its interests on the island. I mean, that's a reality. Again, whether we like it or not, it's irrelevant at that point. Um, and well, that's a situation that we are right now. I mean, for those who follow Cuba closely, I mean, the baseline, in my opinion, is um, whatever situation we have right now. So it didn't start on January the 3rd this year. So the underlying problems have been going on for decades, and there's been many opportunities for the Cuban leadership to introduce meaningful reforms. And I think it's also important to say that this does not only come from Cuba's, let's say, enemies or adversaries. It also comes from its allies. China and Vietnam, has been proved, publicly already several times, but Russia as well, Belarus, um, have indicated, well, you have to introduce reforms in your economy simply because your economic model doesn't work. And that hasn't happened. So it's very sad, actually, as a Cuban, I'm saying this, that at the end, change will come from external pressure. Because the reality is that whether we talk about the economy or Cuba's political system, society, and so on, change is needed, not because Rubio or Trump says that they want change. Change is needed because that system is not delivering to its people. And it should have had taken place many years ago. And at least within the crew of economists that I know, both outside Cuba and inside Cuba, there is almost unanimous consensus on the fact that when it comes to the economic model, that system is exhausted. Not in 2026, but long time ago. It
So
got
we can't even
exhausted.
expect multilateral financing
No,
or aid of any sort, even from some of their uh,
Right.
closest political allies that maybe have adversarial relations with the United States. Because they all are calling for an economic opening at minimum for them to go in, to consider going in. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's the way I see it. Again, the point is, the point I was trying to make is that we should not try to change the orders of importance here. Change is needed not because someone outside Cuba is saying that it's needed. No, change is long overdue in Cuba. Long overdue. That system ceased to deliver to its people long time ago. And that change hasn't happened. And it hasn't happened out of ideological and political calculations. But and then we arrived to 2026 in this situation. And now, well, your neighbor, the US, is seizing the opportunity to advance its interests.
Thank you. Well, in that sober note, we're going to wrap up this webinar. I want to thank both of our speakers, Jorge and Ricardo. I also want to congratulate Ricardo on an excellent paper on the energy crisis in Cuba. Again, you can reach that. You can find that document downloaded on our website, cubastudygroup.org. Um, Jorge, always great to see you and have these conversations with you.
thank
I
you.
also want to recognize our technician, Katia Sanchez, whose face we've seen in a small picture throughout this conversation. Thank you for your help. This entire conversation will be available on our YouTube channel in the coming days. So if you want to watch it again, you can do so there. And well, until next time, thank you all for joining us.